Atheists, and it's the longest chapter in the whole book, and so there's a ton of material, and it's also the hardest chapter, I think, to come up with questions that are interactive, to ask you things during class. So this will probably feel a little bit more like a lecture, though I don't really like that. I want it to be participative. So what I'll do, though, is I'll try to pause throughout and just say, do you have any comments or questions? And if you want to chip in and chime in, you can do that. But yeah, it'll be a little bit more of a lecture than I wanted to, but it's just the nature of the material. Before we start, let's go to our Father in prayer. Father in heaven, we praise your name. We thank you so much that we don't have to worry. We don't have to be filled with anxiety. We can trust you fully, that you have won the victory for us, and all the things that we are most fearful of in this life have been conquered, and Jesus has been victorious over them. Father, we pray that you'll help us this morning to open our hearts and our minds to the information that science gives us, Lord, that we won't be afraid of science, but we'll recognize that science is actually totally on the side of intelligent design and totally consistent with what you revealed in your word. And we pray that we'll have a deeper understanding of that as a result of our class this morning. Thank you for all of our visitors this morning. We pray that they will be blessed with having been here and that they will grow in their spiritual walk with you. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen. All right, so last Sunday we talked about the complex signs of intelligence behind life, especially as seen in the DNA code. You know, if a teenager walked in to the kitchen in the morning and he saw on the table a message spelled out with alphabet cereal, and this alphabet cereal message said, "Take out the garbage, please," never in a million years would that teenager think that that message got there by accident. He would think that there was some intelligent author behind the writing of that message, likely one of his parents, telling him to take out the trash and do his chores. Well, the DNA code isn't just one short sentence, it's an entire language with its own alphabet. And just one single-celled amoeba contains a message the size of 1,000 complete sets of Encyclopedia Britannicas. So 1,000 of that picture is contained in just one single-celled amoeba. That's so important because scientists used to think that the very first life forms, like amoebas, were very simple. And so it was easy to explain. Well, yeah, those just kind of came into existence because they were just so simple. But we know now that even the simplest of life forms is unimaginably complex and coded with its own alphabet arranged into coherent messages. And scientists cannot explain this by natural causes because it has never been observed anywhere that life comes from non-life or that 1,000 Encyclopedia Britannicas worth of coded information could just pop out of nowhere. An atheist microbiologist named Michael Denton, he made an amazingly honest observation about this, and I love what he says here. He says, "The complexity of the simplest known type of cell is so great that it is impossible to accept that such an object could have been thrown together suddenly by some kind of freakish, vastly improbable event." Here's the kicker. Such an occurrence would be indistinguishable from a miracle. That's such a powerful point because the atheists will accuse religious people of having blind faith in miracles. You people, you believe in miracles. The miracle of a creator, making all of these things with intelligence. But they have faith in a miracle too. But the miracle that they have faith in is far more unlikely. It's way more far-fetched to believe that these incredibly complex life forms just came from nothing. Turek points out in the book that we're using that this is kind of like believing that the Library of Congress, which is the largest library in the world, resulted from an explosion in a printing shop. An explosion does not create order, and it does not encode information. But it's even more incredible than that, because in that analogy, atheists cannot even explain how the printing shop exploded in the first place because there was nothing there to explode. How did something get there to explode in the first place? There was no matter before the universe was created. Well, let's talk about Carl Sagan's glaring inconsistency. Carl Sagan was a famous atheist astronomer, and he wrote a book called Contact. And there was later a movie made out of that book. starring Jodie Foster. It's about the very real research team called SETI, which stands for the Search for Extraterrestrial Intelligence. And in the book, the team hears a series of radio waves making sounds in a pattern. And the pattern was a series of prime numbers in consecutive order from 0 to 101. And they were absolutely convinced in that book that that pointed to an intelligent life source. Why? Well, because it's way too far-fetched to think those waves were arranged in that pattern by accident. They knew it was a message coming from an intelligent source. Well, here is Carl Sagan's glaring inconsistency. Even though that book was fictional, of course, he found it convincing enough to his audience, right, to his readers, and for the SETI team to come back and to try to make the case for intelligent life. He found it reasonable enough to use that as an example of intelligent life, this string of prime numbers from 0 to 101. Yet, in real life, Carl Sagan could look at the incredible complexity of the DNA language and the messages encoded in our brains, yet he didn't think that was a sign of intelligence. Sagan described the complexity and the amount of information coded in the human brain this way. He said, and again, he's an atheist, right? He says, if written out in English, that information would fill some 20 million volumes, as many as in the world's largest libraries. The equivalent of 20 million books is inside the heads of every one of us. To put that in perspective, and this is the illustration Turk uses, imagine going to Madison Square Garden, which holds 20,000 seats. And now picture yourself stacking 1,000 books in each seat. The roof would not be high enough to stack 1,000 books. In those seats, you'd have to tear the roof off and continue stacking. That's how much information is contained between our ears. So how could Sagan see a string of prime numbers from 0 to 110 as evidence of an intelligent source, but not see what's between our ears, what's in our brains as signs of an intelligent source? It's just another sign pointing to the bias in the scientific community against anything supernatural. So where we've been so far is to show that atheists cannot use science to explain the origin of life, because there was no matter before the universe was created. So they have to explain how something came from nothing, how life came from non-life. And they have to explain how life with incredibly complex DNA coding and messages came about by unguided, unintelligent, natural forces over time. To believe any of that happened is to believe in a much bigger miracle than Christians believe in. But those are just some of the insurmountable obstacles that we've covered so far for atheism. The next question is, how did we go from quote-unquote simple, single-celled amoebas to more complex life forms, leading ultimately to human beings, of course? And this is where Charles Darwin comes in with his theory of evolution. But before we get there, do you have any comments or questions about where we've been so far in terms of the arguments that we've been looking at, or any of the things that we've said so far before we move into evolution? All right, Herb has something. Yes, and if you'll raise your hand, we'll get you a microphone. That helps everybody in here to hear your comment and also online. But we'll get you one with batteries. So. Okay, here's one with batteries coming.
So would you say that in the case of Carl Sagan, and you're going to probably try to answer this as you go, was it just an unwillingness to admit the complexity and see intelligence
so I will ask that
on his
question.
part?
I will ask that question at the end of class.
Okay.
What keeps them hanging on? And I think we should think about that. What keeps them so desperately clinging? All right, Jeff has one as well. What keeps them desperately clinging to this theory, right, when at every turn it seems like it's opposed? Yeah, Jeff?
Well, I just want to say I finally caught up in the book, in reading the book to where we are now.
Okay.
I got a little behind, and
Sure.
and I got to say, the book can be deep. But sometimes I just have to stop and say I've filled my brain with enough of this and think about it for a while. So I just say that for the audience in general, that sometimes you're reading this, it's like, I don't understand what they're talking about, and I have to read it a couple times, some of the paragraphs to really understand it. But I do find it's presenting some really good information that is difficult for people who rely on science to contradict. And you may not agree with all the details, but it certainly points to an intelligent source that created this and the impossibility of this just happening by random chance.
Yeah.
And that may help in your discussion with some people
Yeah.
who just assume scientists are right in everything they say, and they make a pretty plausible case, and you go, okay, well then that must be right. But the book is good, I think.
Yeah, and I think that the book helps because he uses quotes from atheist scientists, right? He doesn't just say, like, here's what all the Christian scientists are saying, because then you could be accused of bias. But he's actually using quotes from atheist science. I will also say that the book is going to get easier from this point on. After this chapter, the book gets easier. And that's because this is like stuff that we just don't really talk about a lot. We don't talk about microbiology and the origins of life and all of that. So it's just a more unfamiliar territory. But hopefully the combination of reading the book and then having these classes where my attempt and Tim's attempt, like we're trying to present it as simply as possible, can also be very helpful. All right. Well, let's talk about micro versus macro evolution. Charles Darwin, he's the one who first proposed the theory of evolution in 1859 in his book, The Origin of Species. And over the years, he had observed small changes in different animal species, different kinds of birds, pigeons, finches, over time. And he determined that these small changes over time is what's responsible for the vastly different kinds of species that we see today. And this is where we need to define our terms, because there are two different kinds of evolution. One is a fact and one is a theory. Microevolution is a fact. This describes the process of small genetic changes over time within a species. This is why, for instance, within the species of dog, you have a tremendous amount of variation, from Chihuahuas to Great Danes to Golden Doodles. They're all dogs. But through processes, I skipped ahead, through the process of breeding and genetics and mutations and adaptations to their environments, they all appear different. And we see microevolution in every species, basically. I mean, humans, American humans look different than Chinese humans. And people who are African humans look different than Chinese and American humans. Like we just look different because of those microevolutionary changes over time. We're all human beings, but we look different. This is what Charles Darwin observed as part of his research in The Origin of Species. For instance, in the Galapagos Islands, he observed that there were different variations of beaks in finches that changed over time. That's microevolution. That is a proven fact. That is an undeniable, so this is tricky, right? Because atheists will sometimes say, like, oh, you Christians, you don't believe in evolution, Well, what do you mean by that? What kind of evolution are we talking about? Because we absolutely believe in microevolution. Macroevolution, however, is an unproven theory, though our society loves to present it as a fact, even to children, unfortunately. This describes the process of small genetic changes over time that lead to a change from one species to another species altogether. So this isn't just saying, there are a lot of different looking dogs and finches and monkeys, which microevolution supports. This theory says that monkeys will change into human beings over time, that reptiles will change into birds over time. A completely different change from one species to another. But there's a huge problem. We have never observed this happening one time. Any time we've observed genetic mutations or adaptations in species over time, it's always within species. But it's never a change from one species to a totally different one. The Bible calls these species kinds. Genesis 1:21, God created the great sea monsters and every living creature that moves, with which the waters swarmed after their kind, and every winged bird after its kind. And God saw that it was good. And there's multiple verses that you can use there in Genesis that uses that same language. Macroevolution says there have been changes from one kind to another over time, starting with a single-celled amoeba and evolving all the way up to human beings, so that life of every kind and species in the world can ultimately be traced back to a common ancestor, is what they'll say. You can trace it all the way back. All life could go all the way back to just one single-celled life form. And even though we've never observed that from happening, atheists use microevolution as proof for macro, right? Because they'll argue, look, you can notice with microevolution that there are all these small changes that happen over time within species. Well, what if you gave it billions of years to allow those changes to occur? Well, wouldn't it just be the case that if you had all those small changes over billions of years, that eventually it would lead to bigger changes to totally different species? This is what they're arguing. But here are 5 reasons why that is not a reasonable theory. And it's just not supported by the science. Number 1, genetic limits. In 1980, scientists began a painstaking effort to prove macroevolution by purposely mutating each core gene in fruit flies to try to get fruit flies to change from one species to another, to stop being fruit flies and to become something else. They actually won a Nobel Prize for their work, but all they found was that any attempt to change the fly from one species to another resulted either in dead or deformed fruit flies. Couldn't do it. Likewise, a Michigan State team of scientists tracked the evolution of bacteria for 20 years. And bacteria has such a short lifespan, they were able to track 40,000 generations of bacteria within that 20 years, just to see what would happen. And in the end, you know what happened? The bacteria was still bacteria. It did change. There were microevolutionary changes in that bacteria over 20 years, absolutely. But in the end, it didn't change from one thing to another. The bacteria was still bacteria. Why? Because the DNA coding has genetic information built into each species that limit the kind of changes you can make to it. So in the end, dogs will always be dogs, flies will always be flies, monkeys will be monkeys, and boys will be boys. And just as a side, I don't think that's where that came from, but just as a side note, think about this. If scientists can't even make this happen, make a change from one species to another happen using their intelligence, using their intention and teamwork and really, really hard work at it, and they still can't make it happen, how is it reasonable to think that that happened by natural causes with no intelligence guiding it whatsoever? Genetic limits make it impossible. Number 2, cyclical change. So the evolutionary model, at least the macroevolutionary model, it kind of pictures things as evolving in a straight line. It's like you got something simple here, and then it becomes a little bit more complex, a little bit more complex, a little bit more complex. But that's not actually what you see with microevolution. The microevolutionary changes don't happen in a linear direction. They actually go back and forth. They move forward, and then they move backwards again. For instance, Darwin found that the size of the finch's beaks changed back and forth from shorter beaks to longer beaks and back to shorter again, depending on the weather. Because, and I'm not an expert on this at all, okay, but during times of drought, he said finches with smaller beaks didn't survive because they couldn't crack the harder seeds for food. But the larger beaked finches could do so, and so their population flourished. Okay, but in the wet season, those with the smaller beaks flourished because they could handle the softer seeds, and so their population started to flourish. And so you just saw like a swing in the population between the shorter beaks and the longer beaks over time. It wasn't a linear progression from small beak to larger beak to some other more complex feature until eventually it's just a different species, not a finch anymore. It's not what you saw, not what you see. In the end, they were still finches. Thirdly, irreducible complexity. When Darwin first proposed his theory of evolution, he just did not understand how complicated the human cell was. And that wasn't his fault. We didn't have the technology to know that. It was 1859. He could not see into the human cell the way that we could. And so in 2006, a scientist named Michael Behe, he wrote a book called Darwin's Black Box. And he was the man in one of the YouTube videos that I had you all watch in preparation for class. But he argued that, again, back in the 1800s, the human cell was like a black box to Darwin. Like, he just couldn't see inside of it. It was a complete mystery to him. But now that we can see into the cell, we can see into its inner workings, we discovered, again, absolutely mind-boggling, unimaginable complexity. It is like a well-oiled machine. Some have compared the complexity of a cell to a major city, with all these just different parts functioning to the successful working of the whole. And Behe argued that, and this is where the irreducible complexity comes in. This is what it means. He says that it would be impossible for the human cell to have evolved in piecemeal fashion over time, because the cell needs every part in order to function. He called this irreducible complexity because if you try to reduce a cell's complexity in any way by removing one of its parts, it dies. He uses in the book, Behe's book actually, though Turek mentions it as well, but he uses a mousetrap as a simple illustration. A mousetrap has 5 parts: a spring, hammer, holding bar, catch, and platform. Now, in order for that mousetrap to function, it needs all 5 parts at once. You can't just have 4 of those 5 parts. Now, yes, you can make a mousetrap with only 4 parts. But if you have a 5-part mousetrap, it needs all 5 parts in order to actually trap a mouse. That thing to actually snap and hold something in place. So it could not have started with just a platform and a spring and then evolved the other 3 parts over time. Because while it was waiting on the other 3 parts, it would not be able to function. Now, Behe obviously knows that mousetraps are not alive. His atheist might say, well, that's an inanimate object, right? We're talking about life here. But Behe's point is it's even more important with animate objects. It's even more important with life, because if it can't function, it dies. Not like the mousetrap. The mousetrap, with the platform, it'll be fine. It'll just stay a platform. That's it. Okay, but if it's alive, it'll just die. So it needs all those parts. You cannot reduce its complexity. And Behe demonstrates in his 300-page book that there are so many structures and processes in the human body that are irreducibly complex, like the process of blood clotting and cellular propulsion, and even our vision. And he says this, pretty bold statement: the idea of Darwinian molecular evolution is not based on science. There is no publication in the scientific literature anywhere, no journal, no books, that describes how molecular evolution of any real complex biochemical system either did occur or even might have occurred. And this next point is related to irreducible complexity. It's the non-viability. You might think of it as like the non-survivability of transitional forms. So this is directly related to irreducible complexity. It's the idea that if living organisms were in a state of transition from simple to complex, changing into a different species, they would not survive in that in-between state. From the time of transitioning from one species to another, they would be too weak and vulnerable to survive. So for instance, Darwin argued that reptiles evolve slowly over time, from having scales to then having wings like birds. But wings themselves are irreducibly complex. They're incredibly complicated, lots of different parts having to work together in order for a wing to function. And so if a reptile was in a transitional state where it no longer had scales, but neither did it have functioning wings, it just wouldn't work very well. It would have a hard time surviving because it couldn't function fully as a reptile or fully as a bird. Here's another example. Evolutionists would all agree that the female reproductive system of mammals is far more complex than the male reproductive system. And they would all agree that systems that are more complex would have taken far more time to develop and to evolve than a more simple system. So if the female reproductive system took far more time to develop than the male system. How did the males reproduce while they were waiting for thousands of years for the female reproductive system to get there? For that matter, how did the females survive? Okay, because they couldn't reproduce either. Neither the males nor females would have survived while the female reproductive system was in an in-between state of transition. The male and female reproductive systems are irreducibly complex individually, but they're also irreducibly complex together when they work together to actually bring life into the world. Any transitional state before those systems were fully evolved would have kept them from reproducing. And then finally, molecular isolation. Some evolutionists will argue that we must all share a common ancestry because the genetic code is so similar. For instance, the DNA of humans is 90% similar to that of apes. And there are similarities, with other types of life as well, not just humans and apes. But here's the point. Similarities don't necessarily mean we descended from one another. Remember, DNA is like a language with its own alphabet. And just like our alphabet, a sentence may be very similar, but a slight variation in the sentence can change the meaning entirely. So for instance, if I say you're a god or you're a dog, those sentences are 90% the same. But it's that slight difference in the order between the D and the G that makes those sentences mean completely different things. The same thing is true in our DNA code. There may be lots of similarities between us and apes, okay, but just one minor change in the order of that DNA can create entirely different species. And what's more, we have discovered that at the molecular level, each kind of species has its own unique protein sequence in the DNA. If macroevolution were true, we would find protein sequences for transitional forms, like half fish, half amphibians, part reptile, part mammal. We don't find that at all. At the molecular level, each species is isolated with its own unique protein sequencing. This means, based on the evidence at the molecular level, macroevolution, a change from one species to another, looks absolutely impossible. Any comments or questions about any of that? You see what I mean about, how do I ask interactive questions about that? How do you feel about molecular isolation in your life? It's very hard to get interaction, so I appreciate the hands going up. Jeff?
Yeah, I'll just share something that's helped me in my thought on this. If you just go back 150 years ago, before engines were really that developed, if I was a bike owner and I had this idea that I wanted to make a motorized bike, I would not do that following the process of evolution, because that would mean I'd take like a spark plug and tape it to the side of the bike frame. Then I'd add a gas tank, and then I'd add a carburetor, all the different parts on there. And it'd be a useless vehicle. It'd still be a bike until I designed everything to go together at once. Yes. And so I think the fault in trying to apply that to life is that certainly a motorcycle is designed based on a bicycle. It has a similarity there. You might say the bicycle is 90% of a motorcycle, okay, but it's not the same, yes, and it's based on a previous design. I think God did the same thing. We see apes and humans 90% the same. That's just the designer building something based on a previous design, not evolving that design. That makes it clear in my mind. Maybe it will in others.
Yeah, no, that's a really good thought. Yeah, he has an illustration in the book of I can't remember. He starts with like a teaspoon, and then like a little bit of a bigger spoon, and then like a pot that you would put on the stove, and then it goes to like a Dutch oven, and then like a crock pot, right? And so he shows like, okay, these all look very similar, and they're in order from smallest to greatest, and there's a lot of similarities between them, but it doesn't mean that the crock pot descended from the teaspoon. It just means that the same person designed them with similar functions and purposes in mind. So it's not a perfect analogy, nothing is, but I think that point is well taken, Jeff. Yeah, Debbie?
I was just thinking when you were going through this that I'm I mean, I stand in awe of God setting these limits, the genetic limits,
Yeah.
and the fact that, as you know, just I was thinking about the fact that there's a limit to the ocean,
Yeah.
and there's a boundary
Yes.
that we cannot change.
There you go.
That God set, and I'm so thankful because certainly with, you know, misguided minds out there, if we could change all these things, it'd be a mess. We would live in a just chaotic world, and it would be scary, and it would be a mess. So I'm so thankful that God set limits,
Yeah.
and that's not going to happen.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, really good point. Yeah, and the irony is, Terry's got one, Chris has one. Oh, Joe's got one too. Let me just say something real quick off of hers. The irony is that you have all these scientists, and they really are working hard with their intelligence, not just at trying to reproduce macroevolution, but also trying to bring life from non-life. Like they're actually trying to produce spontaneous generation, right? Because then they can say, see, it's possible because it happened at the origin of the universe. But Turek points out in the book the irony of that. Let's say the scientists accomplish it. Let's say they finally get to the point where they create life out of non-life, and they say, aha, see, they've only proven our point, because that was only possible by intelligence. It wouldn't have happened by natural causes, right? It needs an intelligence source to do that. And so we would say, all right, you did that through your intelligence. That means the origin of the universe didn't just get there by non-intelligence either. Like God must have done it. Some intelligent being must have done that. Okay, I think it was Joe and then Terry.
Yeah, so you had mentioned about Darwin and the black box, and I think it's a black box because he, like you said, he did not know. And if he could have known, he would have maybe drawn different conclusions. We don't know. But we do know today there's very, very intelligent scientists who can see so much more with all the electron microscopes and all that kind of stuff. But I find it very interesting that they hang their hats on the ignorance, really, of Darwin. That he had a black box, and they're saying, oh yeah, Darwin did this. But it's very, to me, just confusing, perplexing that they're hanging their hats on a guy that came up with the wrong conclusion because he just didn't know.
Yeah.
And they're trying to, reverse engineer, if you will, back to him, as opposed to saying, hey, wait a minute, So when you were talking about, that's one thing that I was thinking about.
Yeah, because if a Christian said something in 1859 and it was, the evidence started stacking up against it, he would just be immediately written off. That guy was crazy. But people are clinging so desperately. And like I said, we'll talk about that later in this class. Yeah, Terry?
Yeah, I watched Dawkins talking one time on YouTube. I was watching a video, and he was talking about DNA and how DNA is so similar between species, and that it's only minor changes, that produce these large results, And then what his argument was that evolution caused that. But on the flip side of that, if there was a God, that caused these minor DNA changes, that he lacked imagination or that he was somehow lazy. But I would argue just the opposite of that, because when we're doing our work, and the programmers come in, they'll oftentimes use an existing program. They'll upload that, then they'll make minor changes within that existing program to accommodate the new building. So small changes do make big differences, but it's not because the programmer's lazy, it's because he's more efficient. And I think that these minor changes show the efficiency of God, which points to intelligence.
Yeah, that's a good thought. Turek, in the book, he just argues okay, but we're all a part of the same biosphere. So, of course, there's going to be similarities in the genetic code because that's what it takes to survive on the Earth. And he even said if our DNA code was just totally different, there wouldn't be a food chain. So, just some deeper things to think about, which, Dawkins, that's the thing. He'll say things that are just so insulting and often, what a lazy God, It's okay, but there are answers to these things. And sometimes we get intimidated by it because Dawkins, he's really smart. He's a scientist. I don't know. There are answers to these things. And oftentimes it just ends up showing that the other view, right, that God is lazy, as the view that it's just standing on nothing. It's just an assertion without any connection to reality. John?
I don't know if this might be a little off topic or not, I'm not sure, but when you were talking earlier, like points 1 and 2 about from one kind to a different kind, what we do have a record, the fossil record that shows, let's say, we have snakes today, but you go back, whatever, the fossil record showing how much larger they are, but what the fossil record does not show, and there's a paleontologist who has talked about this, is we've shown like how big they were from here and how they've gone from here, but there's, okay, all right. And
go ahead, John. I'm just
thanks a
letting
lot,
you-
man. Take my thunder away.
I know. I'm just-
But what?
no, your points are going to be better than mine, so go ahead.
No, but there's no record there of, let's say, the snake changing into, let's say, the cat or the manta ray or this. Now, what they have, though, in paleontology, what they have had to do and go back is, let's say, they've had a list of so many dinosaurs. And this paleontologist, after a while, they started to do research, and they've had to actually strike certain dinosaurs from the record because they were labeled as something else, and they were actually, let's say, instead of it being something Rex,
Yeah.
it was actually a juvenile T-Rex,
Yeah.
and called something else.
Yeah, exactly.
But they don't really publish those records too much because then it kind of
Sweep it under
exactly
the rug.
sweep it under the floor. Nothing to see here,
Exactly.
folks. Move along.
Move on. Yeah. And this is exactly what I'm going to elaborate on here too, because in June we're going to talk more about carbon dating and the age of the Earth and all of that. So I'm not going to get into that part of the fossils, but I had you watch a YouTube video called Darwin's Biggest Problem. And it is that we still have not found fossils of any transitional species. Darwin wrote this in his book, and I appreciate Darwin because he was honest about his limitations of his theory. He was honest that it was a theory, and that's what drives me crazy too. Not only are we clinging to Darwin, we're calling it something Darwin didn't even call it. Darwin called it a theory. Now we're saying it's a fact, and it's the only way to see it. Darwin said this in his book: "Why then is not every geological formation and every stratum," which is layer of rock, "full of such intermediate links," okay, intermediate transitionary creatures? Geology assuredly does not reveal any such finely graduated organic chain. And this perhaps is the most obvious and gravest objection which can be urged against my theory. Now, that was back in the 1800s. Now, what he did say, though, was, okay, we don't have that yet. But in the future, once we know more, well, we will find these transitional fossils, and then that will then prove my theory true. The problem is, we still haven't. If macroevolution were true, we should have, it's not just that we should have discovered one of them, we should have millions of fossils like this. But we don't. And there have been claims, and this is what John was alluding to, there have been claims that we did find one, and they're called the missing links. But most of those claims, they're exposed as hoaxes. Okay? Or it was a mistake because they thought this is a transitional species, and then later on they just go, oh, that wasn't really a transitional species. That was just a microevolutionary, difference. It was still a T-Rex, or like John said. Okay, but they've all been debunked. Okay, Stephen Jay Gould, an atheist, evolutionary biologist, he points out two major features of the fossil record. Number one, stasis, meaning they did not change over time. Their first appearance in the fossil record looks exactly the same as their last appearance from the fossil record. And suddenness. Fossils tend to appear all at once and fully formed, with no evidence of gradual transformation over time. In fact, most of the fossils we have found are found in layers of rock from what scientists call the Cambrian period, which many of them date to 500 million years old. And again, we can talk about that more in June. But they all appeared abruptly. and fully formed. The concentration of fossils from that period is so vast, so massive and abrupt, that it has been nicknamed the Cambrian explosion. It's basically the Big Bang of fossils, because you had all this history leading up to that point where we had almost no fossils, and then all of a sudden, just boom, all these fossils just appear out of nowhere, fully formed. Now, I suggested a bonus video to you all explaining how the Cambrian explosion matches up perfectly with the Bible's description of a worldwide flood. The fossil record, I want you to see, though, is the complete opposite of what we would expect to find if macroevolution were true. Now, some will line up skulls. All of the apes, the monkey skulls and the Neanderthal and all that stuff, right? And they'll say, see, the ape skulls and the human skulls, they're similar, therefore we descended from them. But 99% of our biology resides in our soft tissue. So it is impossible to tell that we descended from apes just based on fossils. Yet sadly, atheistic scientists will take the 1% that we can learn from the fossils, and they will reconstruct an entire narrative. And you've all seen this picture, this artistic rendering of what happened, right? And that is just a theory. It is not based on strong evidence at all. In fact, Henry Gee, who again is an atheist, evolutionary biologist and paleontologist, and the senior editor of Nature magazine, okay, not a Christian publication by any means, Nature magazine, he said this: to take a line of fossils and claim that they represent a lineage is not a scientific hypothesis that can be tested, but an assertion that carries the same validity as a bedtime story. Amusing, perhaps even instructive, but not scientific. So we've already seen atheists cannot use science to explain how the universe began. They can't use science to explain how unimaginably complex life forms with messages coded into them came from non-intelligent, random, unguided natural forces over time. And they can't use science to explain how we moved from simple to more complex life forms over time. Science can't explain any of it because none of it has ever been scientifically observed, and none of the theories can be tested. On the other hand, we have observed that intelligent design by someone who is spaceless, timeless, and immaterial, and powerful, perfectly fits all the evidence. The fact that the universe, that time, space, and matter all came into existence at once perfectly matches the Bible's claims in Genesis 1. The fact that life is incredibly complex with signs of intelligence and design everywhere matches perfectly with the Bible's claim that God, in His wisdom, in His intelligence, in His personality, created this world. The fact that all the various kinds of species are separate from each other at the molecular level with no evidence of gradual changes from one species to another matches the Bible's claim that God made everything according to its kind. And the fact that there was a massive and sudden appearance of fossils all at once that were fully formed supports the Bible's claim of a worldwide flood. Because you would have had the sediment from the rivers and just burying things alive in that flood. And that's why you see things dying while they're eating. We have fossils of like a fish like eating another fish and he's dead. We have a fossil of a mother animal giving birth and she's just dead. They're just both dead. Why? Because it's just a sudden calamity all at once. Matches perfectly the flood. And here's the saddest part to me. Evolution is taught as a fact to kids in school. And our society believes if we don't teach evolution, well, you're teaching religion in school. But that's not even true. Now, I would love for them to teach kids about God in school. But even if we don't do that, can we at least start by just explaining what the science shows us? If we just teach kids good science and not the bad science that's being propagated these days, it'll go a long way to leading them to God. And this is Turek's argument in his book. He says the reason atheists can't allow this to happen is because they lack faith that their theories will be believed after our children see all the evidence. Because it really is unbelievable. You have to have so much more faith to be an atheist than you do to be a Christian. Again, that was more of a lecture, and we didn't get to our ultimate question about why they're clinging. But thank you guys so much. It is good food for thought to think about that.